Welcome to the deep dive, where we take a stack of information, cut through the noise, and really get straight to the crucial insights. Today, we're plunging into a truly foundational and, frankly, pretty unsettling work from 1895, Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. Now, you might hear 1895 and think, okay, old news, maybe. But Le Bon's observations offer, well, a chillingly relevant look at how groups of people behave, often in ways that surprise and perhaps even disturb us even today. Le Bon argued, quite presciently actually, that his era was entering what he called an era of crowds, where the power of the collective was becoming paramount. So our mission today is to extract the absolute core concepts and, the key facts from this deep dive to truly understand what happens to the individual mind when it becomes absorbed into a crowd. It's a fundamental rethinking, really.
Yeah. And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is that Le Bon wasn't just looking at, casual gatherings like people waiting for a bus or something. He was identifying a very specific phenomenon, a psychological crowd. And this isn't just about physical closeness. It's a kind of transitory collective mind. It has its own distinct characteristics, often radically different from the individuals who make it up. That distinction is absolutely crucial to getting his arguments.
Okay, that idea of a psychological crowd, that sounds fundamental. So what truly defines it for Le Bon? It's got to be more than just people standing near each other, right?
Precisely. Yeah, it's far more than just a large group of people physically present. The key moment, according to Le Bon, is when individuals in a gathering they lose their conscious personality, and their feelings, their sentiments, their ideas all spontaneously turn in one and the same direction. It's almost as if a new single being is formed, operating under what he calls a mental unity. So you could have, say, 1,000 people gathered by chance in a square. Maybe they're not a psychological crowd, but 6 people caught up in a really strong shared emotion or belief. They absolutely could be.
Huh. So it's not really about the numbers then, it's about this shared unified state of mind, almost automatic, like their individual identity just dissolves for a moment.
Exactly. Dissolves is a good word. And what's even more striking, maybe, is that this collective mind, this new entity, is largely dominated by unconscious motives, almost like very primitive beings. Le Bon suggests that in this state, individual brain activity, the higher order stuff, critical thinking, self-awareness, independent judgment, it's sort of paralyzed, temporarily suspended anyway. This allows those primal instincts and collective suggestions to just take over. People literally become, well, like automatons, he says.
Okay, here's where it gets really unsettling for me, and maybe the most provocative claim Le Bon makes. He says an individual in a crowd actually descends several rungs on the ladder of civilization. So someone cultivated, rational, in isolation can become a barbarian within a crowd, acting purely by instinct, capable of extreme violence, ferocity, but also, weirdly, great enthusiasm and even heroism. It fundamentally rethinks human nature, suggesting our very core as rational individuals might just depend on us being alone.
It really does make you pause, doesn't it? Makes you consider how fragile individual reason might be. And this naturally raises the question, okay, what causes this profound, kind of unsettling transformation? Le Bon points to 3 main things, and they're sort of interconnected. First, there's the sense of invincible power and irresponsibility. Just the sheer anonymity of being in a crowd removes that feeling of personal accountability.
Yeah.
So people give in to instincts they'd normally hold back, feeling pretty sure they won't be held responsible.
Okay, anonymity. Makes sense. What else?
Second, there's contagion. Feelings, actions, they spread incredibly rapidly through the group. Le Bon compares it to, like, hypnotic phenomena. Individuals readily sacrifice their personal interest for the collective, whether that's for good or bad. Think of how panic spreads, or, a wave of sudden excitement.
Right, like a ripple effect. And the third?
And third, which he actually considers the most important, is suggestibility. He says individuals in a crowd enter a state that really resembles hypnosis. They lose their conscious personality, and they just obey suggestions, almost without thinking. And this power gets massively amplified when the suggestion is the same for everyone. He gains this huge strength through everyone reinforcing it for everyone else.
Wow. So, okay, on one level, maybe a jury delivers a verdict that, individual jurors, if you ask them privately, might disapprove of. Or on a much bigger scale, like the French nobility on August 4th, 1789, they collectively renounced privileges they'd never have given up alone.
Exactly.
That's wild. It's a powerful demonstration of that suggestibility. The individual is literally not themselves.
Precisely. The individual self is just temporarily switched off almost.
So with this new collective being formed, this crowd mind, What does Le Bon say about how they actually feel and reason? Do they operate on the same kind of logic as individuals?
Oh, not at all. Not even close. Crowds show extreme impulsiveness, mobility, irritability. They're always at the mercy of external stimuli, like leaves in a storm, he says. They can swing from, bloodthirsty ferocity to extreme generosity and heroism in an instant, which makes them incredibly difficult to govern or even predict. They can't really think or maintain a will for any length of time. Their desires are intense but fleeting.
And what also stands out is how incredibly credulous they are, right? So easily influenced by suggestion, just accepting images in their minds as reality, even when those images are completely twisted from what actually happened. It's like their critical thinking is just gone, like in a dream or something.
You've hit on a core point there.
Yeah.
Their imagination is powerful and very easily impressed. Le Bon gives some pretty vivid historical examples. Like the crew of the ship Belle Poule, clear sunny day, apparently they collectively hallucinated seeing a disabled vessel with men on a raft. Turned out it was just a few tree branches floating in the water. Or things like psychic phenomena witnessed by supposedly distinguished scientists who, under the power of suggestion within the group, later admitted they were just simple conjuring tricks they'd fallen for. Even heartbreaking stuff like mothers falsely recognizing drowned children who weren't their own, just based on an initial illusion that then spread through contagion. It shows how easily facts get distorted. The fact that lots of witnesses agree on something, Le Bon argues, is often actually very poor proof because of this suggestibility.
So if they're that credulous, swayed by imagination, what about reasoning? Can you actually appeal to logic with a crowd? Is that ever effective?
Absolutely not. He's very explicit about this. Crowds are not influenced by reasoning. Their arguments, if you can even call them that, are of an inferior kind. They're based on sort of surface-level connections, not logical steps. Like his example of a savage thinking he'll get bravery by eating an enemy's heart. It's that kind of association, not deduction.
Yeah.
So an orator should never, ever appeal to reason when talking to a crowd. They have to appeal to sentiment, emotion, images, 20 volumes of logical arguments. Worthless compared to a few catchy phrases that evoke powerful, simple pictures. The critical spirit is just absent.
That's quite a thing to digest. So, okay, if reason doesn't work and the crowd's critical thinking is basically offline, how do ideas take hold? How do they become powerful beliefs within this collective mind? What's the mechanism there?
Well, the ideas themselves have to be presented as absolute, uncompromising, and simple, always in the form of vivid images. The crowd just doesn't grasp nuance or complexity. What's more, contradictory ideas can actually exist side by side in the collective mind because there's no critical faculty noticing the contradiction. And once an idea manages to become a sentiment, a feeling lodged deep in the unconscious mind of the crowd, it gains this irresistible, almost organic power. It's often a slow burn for ideas to really take root, sometimes decades, even centuries.
Yeah.
But once they're in there, they are incredibly hard to get rid of.
Like maybe the philosophical ideas of the Enlightenment took nearly a century to filter down and really implant themselves, but then they caused the French Revolution this massive, violent upheaval.
Precisely. That's a perfect example. And this links directly to the crucial role of illusions. Le Bon argues pretty bluntly that illusions, whether they're religious, philosophical, social, have always been the driving force behind civilizations. He states very starkly that crowds inherently prefer illusions to truth. If you can supply them with illusions, you're their master. If you try to destroy their illusions with cold, hard facts, you become their victim. Socialism, in his time, he saw as the latest powerful illusion, promising happiness, despite what he felt were scientific arguments against it. He famously wrote, "The masses have never thirsted after truth." Quote, "They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduce them." It's quite a statement.
That's a profound and yeah, almost cynical take on human nature. So if crowds prefer illusions and they're immune to logic, how do truths or, new correct understandings ever get established? Is there any way to break through that?
Le Bon suggests only one real way: experience. But not just any old experience. It has to be on a very large scale and very frequently repeated. And often it comes at a huge cost. The French Revolution, for instance, despite the immense bloodshed and chaos, was, in Le Bon's view, a brutal experiment needed to prove that society can't just be remade based on pure reason alone. But even experiences that clear, that costly, are often forgotten by the next generation. It shows how incredibly difficult it is to dislodge those deeply held, maybe comforting illusions. It's a slow, painful process.
Okay, so given this highly suggestible, emotional, illogical nature of the crowd,
Yeah.
who steps into that void of reason, who guides them? What makes a leader effective in that kind of environment?
Well, crowds instinctively need a leader. They crave authority. And these leaders, Le Bon says, are often less men of thought and more men of action. They're often kind of hypnotized by their own ideas, possessing this enduring, sometimes almost blind strength of will that can just bulldoze through any obstacle, human or natural. Think of Ferdinand de Lesseps, absolutely fixated on building the Suez Canal against all odds. Or Napoleon, inspiring just immense awe. Leaders basically give crowds faith and organize their otherwise chaotic energy.
Right. And what tools do these leaders use to get that influence, if it's not logic?
Le Bon points to three main tools, almost indispensable ones. First, affirmation. Just simple, pure statements, free of any reasoning or proof. The shorter, the punchier, the better. Think of slogans or the direct commands in religious texts or laws. Second, and this is absolutely crucial for affirmation to stick, is repetition. Napoleon supposedly said it's the only rhetorical trick that really matters. You just keep repeating something. It embeds itself in the unconscious mind, slowly becoming an accepted truth. It's, like effective advertising today, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the third?
And third is contagion, which we touched on. Ideas, feelings, emotions, beliefs, they spread through crowds like microbes. This explains sudden panics, frenzies, even forms of collective madness. And interestingly, it can even spread upwards from lower social classes to higher ones. He gives the example of early socialist doctrine starting among workers and then influencing the educated classes.
And then there's this almost mystical force he calls prestige. What's that all about? How does that fit in with leaders? It sounds almost hypnotic in itself.
Yeah, prestige is this profound kind of domination. It paralyzes your critical thinking and just fills your soul with astonishment and respect. He says it's the mainspring of all authority. Le Bon splits it into two types. There's acquired prestige, which comes from things like a famous name, wealth, reputation, or even external symbols like a judge wearing robes, commands respect partly because of the robes, the office. And then there's personal prestige.
Yeah.
This is more like a magnetic, fascinating power that's independent of titles or position.
Yeah.
He points to figures like Buddha, Jesus, Mohammed, Napoleon. It's this inherent force that just compels awe.
Huh. So Napoleon's generals were apparently awestruck by him even when he was just an unknown general.
Exactly.
And his personal prestige was so immense, Le Bon says, that it let him basically walk back into power after escaping Elba without even needing a fight. That really suggests prestige is key for a leader, maybe more than anything else.
Absolutely. In fact, success is one of the biggest contributors to prestige. Le Bon argues that the moment success disappears, prestige often vanishes right along with it. And then the crowd, who moments before adored the hero, takes revenge on them for having fallen. He uses Robespierre as an example, worshipped one day, executed the next, once his power and mystique faded. It's a brutal, unforgiving cycle.
Wow, yeah, a powerful and often tragic cycle. So it sounds like crowds are incredibly changeable, almost fickle, but Le Bon also talks about fixed beliefs. How do those two ideas fit together? They seem kind of contradictory.
That's a really perceptive question. Yeah, there's this core substratum, he calls it, of fixed beliefs that exist in every historical race or culture. These are incredibly difficult to uproot. They fundamentally define a civilization. They're almost like the anatomical characteristics of a society. They take geological ages to change. Think about the persistence of certain religious ideas, maybe, or the core need for centralization in Latin countries, he argues, even after multiple revolutions try to change it. These are the deep, slow-moving currents.
Okay, so there's that deep layer, but then floating on top, there are changeable opinions.
Exactly. Yes, these are the more superficial ideas that constantly spring up and die out. Le Bon observed that the breakdown of those older general fixed beliefs combined with the rapid rise of the press in his day meant opinions were becoming much more mobile, less deeply held than ever before. And this also leads, he thought, to a growing indifference in crowds towards anything that doesn't directly impact their immediate tangible interests. Governments, he argues, were becoming increasingly powerless to actually direct public opinion the way they used to.
This brings to mind Le Bon's pretty pointed critique of the French Latin education system back then. He thought it created discontented individuals, unprepared for real life, and made them susceptible to socialism. How does that connect to how ideas form in crowds? Is it like a background factor?
Yeah, he sees it as a critical remote factor. It shapes the very ground on which crowds form and ideas can take root. Le Bon argued that an education system based mainly on rote learning, memorizing textbooks without developing judgment or initiative, well, it creates this army of diploma holders who look down on manual labor and only want state jobs. Then, When there aren't enough of those jobs, you get widespread discontent, social unrest. It prepares the ground, as he puts it, for revolutionary ideas. He saw it creating a bourgeoisie that was, in his words, frivolous, at once skeptical and credulous, always blaming the government. And he starkly contrasted this with what he saw in the Anglo-Saxon system, which he felt emphasized practical training, personal initiative, fostering more independent thought and adaptability.
So Le Bon isn't just theorizing in the abstract. He's applying these ideas to real-world groups. Let's look at some specifics he mentions. What did he find while looking at criminal crowds, like maybe those involved in the September massacres during the French Revolution?
Well, he describes them as being driven entirely by suggestion and largely unconscious of their actual actions. They genuinely believed they were fulfilling some kind of patriotic duty or higher purpose. What's really striking is the almost bizarre contradiction they often showed. Immense ferocity, yes, but coexisting with surprising bursts of compassion or even a kind of strict, conventional morality, like refusing to steal money from the people they were killing. Their actions might be legally criminal, he says, but psychologically they were essentially automatons just acting out the collective suggestion, not truly responsible in the individual sense.
And juries, how do they function as crowds? You'd think a jury room would be the place for individual reason to prevail.
Apparently not, according to Le Bon. Juries, even when made up of educated people, become highly suggestible as a group. They show very little capacity for logical reasoning, especially on general questions rather than specific facts. They're profoundly impressed by prestige, whether it's the social standing of the accused, their wealth, or the reputation of a famous lawyer. Interestingly, he notes they tend to be quite lenient on crimes of passion, like infanticide by mothers, but very severe on crimes that seem to threaten society directly. It reflects a kind of instinctive rather than reasoned sense of justice. He shares this amazing anecdote about a famous lawyer, Lachaud, who apparently won over a really stubborn juryman, not by arguing the case, but just by pretending to be concerned about the sun shining in the juryman's eyes. Pure psychological play, appealing to perceived empathy.
That's incredible. Just pure manipulation. What about electoral crowds? And parliamentary assemblies, we often think of those as, the height of democratic reasoning.
Well, Le Bon sees electoral crowds displaying very similar traits to other crowds. Very little reasoning ability, no critical spirit, huge credulity. Candidates, he says, need prestige far more than actual talent or well-reasoned arguments. Voters are swayed by catchy, often vague formulas. He gives the example of the Federal Republic in Spain, which apparently led to massacres because everyone interpreted it differently. These slogans work because they resonate as simple images. Arguments often get replaced by just blunt affirmations, insults, invectives, even physical fights sometimes. As for parliamentary assemblies, he argues they embody the same intellectual simplicity, irritability, suggestibility, and exaggerated sentiments common to all crowds. They often act automatically, sometimes even voting against their own individual interests when they're swept up by strong leaders who possess that vital prestige.
Yeah.
He suggests they only really apply proper individual intelligence when dealing with highly technical matters, where they essentially defer to a specialist who acts as a temporary, trusted leader for that specific issue.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into the crowd really reveals a profound and, frankly, a little unsettling truth about human nature, or at least a perspective on it. The collective mind seems to operate on a fundamentally different logic than the individual. It's driven by instinct, emotion, suggestion, far more than by individual reason or critical thought.
Yeah, and if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, Le Bon suggests that civilizations rise when a people forms what he called a unified racial genius. Basically, a shared, almost innate collective spirit and ideal that binds them together, gives them direction and strength. But when that ideal weakens, fades, loses its power, the race, the culture, it fragments back into just a swarm of isolated individuals, essentially returning to the primitive, chaotic state of being a crowd, making it susceptible to dissolution, decline, maybe even collapse. It's a stark, almost cyclical view he presents, from barbarism up to civilization, and potentially back down again.
It is a stark cycle, from the highest forms of societal organization, potentially right back to chaos. Le Bon's era of crowds, as he called it, means that understanding these powerful, often hidden forces isn't just, an academic exercise. It's absolutely essential for navigating our world. And maybe, just maybe, more so now than ever before. So for you, the listener, maybe consider this. In an age where information spreads instantly, where people gather in vast virtual crowds online through social media, digital movements, how do Le Bon's insights about the power of suggestion, the rapid spread of contagion, and that enduring preference for illusions manifest today? And maybe more importantly, What are the implications for our own individual autonomy, for the very nature of truth, when we're faced with such powerful collective forces, both online and off? Something to think about.